All right, so think about it like this. Like, remember that first day, at a new job,
Yeah.
when you're just trying to figure everything out, what to wear, who to ask if you need something,
Right, right. All the unwritten rules.
all those, yeah, all the unspoken stuff, and all the office politics too.
Oh,
We've
yeah.
all kind of been there. Now imagine all that, but you've also just landed in a completely new country,
Yeah.
different culture, different customs. You're not totally fluent in the language.
Yeah.
And just a totally different way of doing things in the workplace, professionally, stuff you wouldn't even think about.
Yeah. Different set of expectations altogether.
It's a lot to deal with. So that's what we're going to dig into today.
Exactly.
We're going to explore all those psychological challenges that skilled immigrants often face when they're trying to integrate into a new work environment.
Right, right.
And we're basing this deep dive on this fascinating white paper by Kiran Gokal. It's really eye-opening.
It is. It's really insightful.
And it really highlights this interesting point that a lot of times we're talking about highly skilled people.
Yes. Absolutely.
So it's not like they're, struggling with the actual work itself.
Right. It's not a skills gap or anything like that.
Right. They're often experts in their field.
Top of their game. Yeah.
But they're dealing with all these cultural differences and unspoken rules and stuff.
The hidden curriculum of the workplace.
Yeah, exactly. The hidden curriculum. I love that. So for you listening, our goal today is to really unpack these specific stressors.
Yeah.
Figure out what kind of impact they have on people, and also look at what we can all do, to create workplaces that are more supportive.
More welcoming, more inclusive.
Exactly. More inclusive, more welcoming. And, this is relevant whether you're an immigrant professional yourself.
Of course, yeah.
Or if you work with people who are, or if you're just, interested in the whole idea of global mobility and how it affects people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a topic that touches so many aspects of our lives, really.
So the white paper kicks off with this kind of surprising contrast, actually. You know how we often hear about skilled immigration and we focus on the positive stuff?
Yeah, the opportunities, the economic benefits, the whole...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The whole idea of coming to a new country for a better life. And that's definitely real.
Right, it's part of the picture for sure.
But there's this other side to it, this hidden reality that a lot of people face.
This less visible side of the story.
Yeah, and it's not just about fitting into a new society,
No, it's so much deeper than that.
It's about this whole professional integration process and all these new norms and expectations that come with it.
You're absolutely right. I think the paper does a fantastic job of highlighting that this isn't just about, getting used to different social customs.
Right.
It's really about navigating this whole new professional landscape.
Mm-hmm.
It can be incredibly challenging.
So let's dive into that hidden reality a little bit. Anyone listening who's had a few different jobs in their career, they've probably run into these unwritten rules in different workplaces.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In every workplace, there's a set of unspoken rules that kind of dictate how things work.
Exactly. And the paper uses this phrase, cultural shock in professional settings. And it's not just about knowing which fork to use at the company lunch.
Right.
It goes way deeper. It's about how you interact with your colleagues, how you communicate, how you get feedback.
What's fascinating to me is how subtle it can be.
Yeah.
I mean, we often think of cultural differences in these very broad strokes, right?
Yeah.
But the white paper really zooms in on these very specific, unspoken hierarchies that exist in every workplace.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And they can be a complete mystery to someone coming from a different background.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Think about power dynamics, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
How those are communicated. In one culture, a quiet sort of deference to authority might be seen as respectful.
Yeah.
But in another culture, it might be interpreted as a lack of initiative.
Huh, that's a good point.
And then you have different communication styles. Imagine you're used to giving and receiving very direct feedback.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're in a workplace where everything's very indirect.
Yeah, that would be confusing.
It would be. Trying to understand how you're performing becomes this constant exercise in deciphering subtle cues. Reading between the lines.
Yeah, that's exhausting.
It can be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, this difference, where direct feedback might seem harsh to some, but then indirect feedback could be completely missed by others.
Yeah.
That's such a key insight, both for the immigrant professional and for their colleagues.
And then there's the whole social dynamic in the workplace, which, I mean, we've all experienced this.
Oh,
You
yeah.
walk into the break room and everyone's got their little groups and their inside jokes, and it can be tough to break into that, especially if you're from a different culture.
Absolutely. And it's often in those informal interactions, right? The water cooler chats, the after-work drinks.
Yeah, where you actually learn stuff.
Exactly. That's where so much crucial information gets shared.
And you build relationships.
And relationships.
If you're not part of that, you're missing out.
You're kind of on the outside.
Yeah. And on top of all that, the paper talks about how performance metrics and management expectations can be totally different.
Absolutely. What defines good work, a successful project? That's not universal.
It's so true.
Some cultures might value individual brilliance above all else,
Right.
while others might prioritize team collaboration and consensus building.
So how do you even know if you're doing a good job?
Exactly. And that's the challenge. Without that clear understanding of what's being measured, what's valued, immigrant professionals can feel like they're aiming at a constantly moving target.
Yeah, no wonder people feel anxious and uncertain.
It's a huge amount of pressure.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, and I think anyone listening who's ever felt that pressure in their career, they'll relate to this.
Okay.
The paper talks about this fear of vulnerability, and it makes so much sense, right? Think about it. These are people who've often gone through a lot to get to where they are.
They've navigated a complex immigration process,
Yeah.
often leaving behind their support networks, their families.
They might have had to learn a new language.
Yes.
And they're constantly under pressure to prove they were the right choice, to justify all the sacrifices they and their families have made.
It's a lot to carry.
So imagine asking for help or admitting you don't understand something. It can feel like you're confirming all those doubts people might have about you.
They're almost afraid to show any weakness.
Exactly. And that can really hold you back from learning and adapting.
It can create this vicious cycle.
Okay, but isn't there support? Like, when people move to a new country, aren't there organizations that help them?
There often are, yes. Community groups,
Yeah.
cultural organizations that help with things like housing, language, navigating the local culture.
But not so much in the workplace.
That's the interesting thing. The paper draws this really important distinction between societal integration and professional integration.
Huh.
There might be resources for settling into a new country, finding an apartment, learning the bus routes.
Yeah.
But when it comes to navigating the specific challenges of a new workplace culture, that support is often lacking.
And that's got to be tough.
It is. Colleagues might be well-intentioned, but they might not have that specific cultural sensitivity.
Right.
Or even if they do, they might not have the time or the resources to provide that kind of mentorship.
It's like everyone's so busy with their own stuff.
Exactly. And then you have HR departments, which often treat orientation as this kind of one-time event.
Checklist.
Yeah, like a checklist.
Yeah.
Fill out these forms, watch these videos, and you're good to go.
Right. But it's not that simple.
No, it's a much more ongoing process.
So you're basically saying these professionals are often left to figure things out on their own.
Sadly, that's often the case. The paper calls it this self-orientation period.
Which sounds really stressful.
It can be, especially when you're already dealing with all the other pressures of adjusting to a new life.
And it can really impact their ability to perform at their best.
This leads us to what the paper identifies as the performance paradox.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So you have these highly skilled individuals, right? They've got impressive qualifications, tons of experience.
They were hired for a reason.
Exactly. But they might initially underperform in their new roles.
So what's going on there?
Well, it can stem from a lot of things. It could be something as simple as misinterpreting their job responsibilities.
Right.
Or maybe they're hesitant to ask clarifying questions because they don't want to seem incompetent.
That fear of vulnerability we were talking about.
Exactly. Or they might just be struggling to understand the unspoken dynamics of the workplace.
Like all the office politics and stuff?
Exactly. And you can see how this situation would be frustrating
Yeah.
for everyone involved.
Yeah, I can see that. The employee probably feels like they're not living up to their own potential.
Right.
And the employer's probably wondering why this person they thought was so great isn't delivering.
It can create a lot of tension. And the paper really emphasizes that this disconnect often isn't about a lack of skill or knowledge.
So it's not like they hired the wrong person.
No, not necessarily. It's more about this mismatch between expectations and the immigrant professional's current psychological state.
They're just not in the right headspace to perform at their best.
Exactly. And the longer this period of adaptation drags on, the more it impacts their well-being.
And we're not just talking about, like, feeling a little
No,
stressed.
it goes much deeper than that. The paper lists a whole range of potential impacts, from sleep disturbances and chronic fatigue.
Which, I mean, that's your body's way of saying something's wrong.
Absolutely. It's a physiological response to chronic stress.
And then there are the feelings of isolation and alienation.
You're in a new country, a new workplace. You might not have your usual support network.
It's a recipe for loneliness.
And then on top of that, you have the potential for physical symptoms like headaches, digestive issues.
Wow, it really affects your whole body.
And then, tragically, there's the increased risk of developing clinical depression and anxiety.
That's really serious.
It is. And the stigma surrounding mental health, especially in some cultures, combined with the potential language barriers to accessing care.
That makes it even harder to get help.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't underestimate the impact on their self-esteem, on their sense of professional identity.
Yeah, especially for people who've always been high achievers.
Exactly. They might start to question their own competence, their value.
So we've talked about all the challenges, but the paper doesn't just leave us there, right?
No, thankfully not. It also offers some very practical recommendations for employers.
Good. So what can employers do to create a more supportive environment?
Well, first and foremost, it's about moving beyond that traditional one-week orientation.
Yeah, that's not enough.
It's not nearly enough. The paper recommends implementing structured integration programs that last for several months.
So like 3 to 6 months of ongoing support.
Exactly. It's about providing clear guidance, regular check-ins, making sure people feel supported throughout the entire process.
That makes sense.
And another key recommendation is establishing formal mentorship or buddy systems.
So pairing new employees with someone who can help them navigate the workplace culture.
Exactly. Someone who can answer those questions they might feel hesitant to ask their manager.
Someone who can be a friendly face.
Absolutely. Someone who could be a cultural guide, a resource, a friend.
And the paper also talks about the importance of regular well-being check-ins.
Yes, and ideally, incorporating those into the performance review process.
So it's not just about how much work they're getting done.
It's about how they're doing as a whole person.
That sends a powerful message.
It does. It shows that the employer genuinely cares about their well-being.
And what about the overall culture of the workplace?
Well, creating a culture of psychological safety is paramount.
What does that mean?
It means encouraging people to ask questions, valuing diverse perspectives, seeing mistakes as opportunities for learning rather than as failures.
So basically making it okay to not be okay.
Exactly. And it also means training managers to recognize the signs of struggle in their immigrant team members.
Because people might not always be comfortable speaking up.
Right. Sometimes it's about picking up on the subtle cues.
And it's not just the immigrant employee's responsibility to adapt, right?
No, absolutely not. The paper is very clear about that. It emphasizes the need for cultural literacy training for everyone in the workplace.
So not just focusing on the newcomers.
Exactly. It's about creating a truly inclusive environment where everyone understands and respects different cultural norms.
And that includes things like unconscious bias training.
Absolutely. Addressing those hidden biases we all have can make a huge difference.
And just creating opportunities for people from different backgrounds to connect and learn from each other.
Yes, building those bridges of understanding is so important.
Now, here's something I found really insightful. The paper talks about the disconnect that can sometimes exist between an immigrant's social and professional lives.
That's a really interesting point.
Like, they might have built a great social network outside of work, with friends from their own culture.
Right, they've found their community.
But the workplace can still feel very isolating,
And that can create this kind of dual identity situation.
where they feel like they have to be different people in different settings.
Exactly. They might feel comfortable and authentic in their social life, but then in the workplace, they feel like they have to put on a mask
To hide any confusion or uncertainty.
to fit in, to appear competent.
And that can't be good for their mental health.
No, that constant code switching can be exhausting and emotionally draining.
So what happens if employers don't address these issues? What if they just ignore the whole psychological integration piece?
Well, the paper outlines some pretty serious long-term consequences, both for the individual and for the company.
Lay it on me.
For employers, you're looking at higher turnover rates among your immigrant staff.
Which is costly.
Very costly. You're constantly having to recruit and train new people. And you're also losing out on all the skills and experience those employees brought to the table.
Not to mention the impact on morale.
Absolutely. If people don't feel supported and valued, they're not going to stick around.
And then there's the loss of diverse perspectives.
Which is so crucial in today's globalized world. You need people with different backgrounds, different ways of thinking to be truly innovative and competitive.
And then, of course, there's the potential damage to the company's reputation.
Yeah, if you get a reputation for not being inclusive, it's going to make it harder to attract top talent.
And what about the individual? What are the potential consequences for them?
Well, the paper highlights some really heartbreaking possibilities. People might give up on their career goals.
Because they just feel so defeated.
Exactly. They might experience a decline in their mental health, which can have ripple effects on their entire life.
Yeah, and it can affect their families, too.
Absolutely. The stress can spill over into their personal relationships.
So it's a really important issue with far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely.
Right.
And Kiran Gokal's white paper makes a very powerful argument for prioritizing psychological integration.
It's not just about getting people in the door.
It's about creating a workplace where they can truly thrive.
So let's sum up what we've learned from our deep dive into this really important topic.
Okay.
Skilled immigrants coming into new workplaces, they often face these huge psychological challenges.
Challenges that are often invisible to those around them.
And these challenges can really affect their well-being.
And their ability to perform at their best.
So employers, they need to step up and provide proactive support.
Support that goes way beyond just the basics of onboarding.
We need to create workplaces that are inclusive and psychologically safe.
Where people feel comfortable being themselves, asking questions, making mistakes.
Where cultural differences are seen as assets.
Exactly. That's how we truly unlock the potential of a diverse workforce.
Now here's a final thought for you to ponder. And it builds on something the paper mentions in its conclusion.
Okay.
Considering all the amazing things skilled immigrants bring to the table, all their talents, their experiences, their perspectives, what do we need to change?
Yeah.
Like, what fundamental shifts do we need to make in our workplace cultures to ensure that they don't just survive, but they thrive?
That's a powerful question.
And it's one we should all be asking ourselves.
Absolutely. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, if you want to learn more about this topic, we encourage you to check out the resources available in your own workplace or community. There's a lot of great research out there on cross-cultural integration, and there might be organizations dedicated to supporting immigrant professionals in your area.
So do your homework and get involved. It's a topic that deserves our attention.
Absolutely.
All right, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for having me.
It was great having you.